Aaron.
Here.
Why didn't you say it the first time I said Aaron?
Because it's pronounced Aaron.
You done messed up, Aaron.
Aaron is here. Welcome back, everyone, for more SPTV, where every day is a great day not to be in a cult. Thank you for joining me this evening, everyone. I genuinely and truly think this might be one of the most important videos I've ever done on this channel. Yes, what we're going to talk about tonight is what I genuinely believe is going to be how the Church of Scientology will fall. And this is a video I first mentioned wanting to do a couple months ago, maybe somewhere between 4 to 6, 8 weeks ago. And what we're talking about tonight also has to do with why the LAPD commissioners meeting happened also a couple months ago when me and Jenna and Serge did sort of an organized, planned, pre-written series of speeches at the LAPD commissioners meeting, talking about the California Child Abuse and Neglect Reporting Act, CANRA. And the report that Serge read was a report from a Scientologist parent to some Scientology authorities, specifically detailing an incident that had occurred to one of her family members. And it was specifically read aloud at the LAPD commissioners meeting to serve as an example that could be reported on of how Scientologists will document in writing to other Scientologists and Scientology authorities crimes against children. And that this is commonplace in Scientology. It's commonplace. And all Scientologists know that anytime any of this stuff is documented internally, it is always only handled internally. And it is never reported externally to authorities. And that, in fact, reporting such things externally to the authorities is punishable by expulsion from Scientology. However, committing the crimes against children is not oftentimes punishable by, it's not mandated to be punishable by expulsion from Scientology. And this creates an environment where it's simply culturally in Scientology considered to be illegal to report crimes against children to the authorities. And any Scientologist knows that. Any Scientologist will tell you that. Although Scientology will deny that with a straight face in a court of law. So, okay. So we did that event at the LAPD Commission. That was part of a greater plan. That plan is still in motion. That plan hasn't, that whole plan hasn't played out yet. It hasn't even been reported on yet, but it will. Just wait. You guys will see what's going on with that. Now, right around that same time, I think it was actually after we did the LAPD commissioners meeting. Someone sent me a link to an episode of the Mormon Stories podcast. And I'm going to share, here's at least what the YouTube channel looks like is here. Mormon Stories podcast. And the guy who runs this channel is a former Mormon named John DeLynn. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. And he's not only a former Mormon, he's also a PhD in clinical psychology, which is a heck of a combination. I wish we had one of those in the former Scientology world. And if we do, and I just don't know about it yet, somebody please tell me about it at growingupinScientology@gmail.com. So John DeLynn did an interview, and it was somewhat of an urgent last-minute interview. It seems like he himself had just found out about this ongoing massive litigation against the Mormon Church, specifically in the state of California, but also in federal court. And he had the attorneys, he had the two attorneys who were leading that litigation come onto his podcast for a live 3-hour interview. I have now listened to that entire interview, including today, 4 complete times. The first time I listened to this interview, I said, holy shit. Holy shit. I said, if this is what's happening if this is what is successfully being carried out in the courts, both state and federal, against an institution as rich and powerful and with as many members as the Mormon Church, Scientology has no hope. Now, of course, you've got everything that's happened over the years with the Catholic Church. But I'm less familiar with everything that's happened with the Catholic Church. I'm less familiar with how all that litigation went down. And I think the size of the Mormon Church, although the Mormon Church is probably still 100 times larger than Scientology, Catholicism is just a whole nother level. And it's almost a better comparison, Scientology to Mormonism, even though Scientology could only dream of being as rich and big as the Mormon Church. But as I listened to the podcast and the lawyers, and the attorneys are unbelievable, as I listened to, well, all the details, all the discussion of litigation and some of the details, I couldn't help but think to myself how the reality in Scientology is even more disgusting and well documented as the already horrifically disgusting stuff I was hearing about these lawsuits. And I thought, this is how it happens. This is how it happens. Okay, let me introduce you to these attorneys. We have Ann Andrews, the founder of this law firm, Andrews Thornton. I think she said she founded it about 40 years ago. And she is one of the guests on this podcast. And one of the attorneys at her firm, Kimberly Dagonia, is the other guest on the podcast. And I have gone through this 3-hour podcast, and I have made meticulous timestamps of the segments that we are gonna watch together. And I've tried to be as meticulous as I have been on this, because this, to me, for me, I'm doing this for the record. I'm doing this so that it exists on this channel forever. I'm doing this so that I can chop all this up into a bunch of segments and publish it to the other channel, my clips channel. I'm doing this so that I can share this video with every former Scientologist out there. We're going to take our time. This, in my opinion, the beginning of the end of Scientology is already behind us. The beginning of the end has already occurred. Anyone who has ever been a victim of child sex abuse in Scientology, and I want to say not just limited to the United States, but obviously when we're talking about litigation in the United States, it obviously helps if there's some component that involves the United States. So, for example, in our community, Miriam Francis's experience has been well documented. And whereas, and I could be wrong about this, this is to the best of my recollection, whereas the actual abuse she suffered was in Australia and maybe over in England, I have a very high risk of getting the details of this wrong. The fact that Miriam later came to the United States, was in the Sea Org in the United States, the fact that her father was in the Sea Org in the United States, the fact that the Scientologist authorities who knew what her father did were in the United States, that adds an important U.S. component to that experience, even if the abuse itself might have actually occurred outside of the United States, which, again, you can fact check me on that in case I have that wrong. But I'm just using that as an example. Anyone who has ever been a victim of child sex abuse in Scientology, especially if there is a U.S. component to the story, to the experience, even if you think I already know who you are, please, if you're watching this video, shoot me an email at growingupinscientology@gmail.com and say, if this is how you feel, I would like to be involved in any mass litigation that occurs against Scientology for violating the statutes that we are going to hear all about tonight. Because this is how Scientology, as we know it, comes to an end, in my opinion. Okay. Let me pull up the actual podcast here. We're just going to start out with a bit of a 2-minute introduction of Ann Andrews and her associate. Here we go.
No one's going to know the facts of those proceedings better than our two guests. So let me begin by first welcoming Ann Andrews for the first time to Mormon Stories Podcast. Hi, Ann.
Hi, John.
Thanks for coming.
Thanks for inviting us.
Tell us just briefly kind of what you do, what your firm does, and
Certainly.
anything else you want to say by way of introduction.
So I'm Ann Andrews, the founding managing partner of Andrews & Thornton. We are a law firm that is of many things we do, a national law firm. We have cases across the country, but we have focused for many, many years on sexual abuse in many aspects of life. All churches, all organizations, schools, anywhere where we have found predators abusing children, our law firm has been there in the court seeking justice for those victims. And we're joined today by Kimberly Gonia, and she can tell you about her background, but she and I met about 2 years ago, and she joined the firm with a tremendous amount of experience in the areas of sexual assault in the criminal field, the criminal aspect of sexual assault and sex trafficking. And Kimberly's seated to my left.
Hi, Kimberly. Thanks for joining us today.
Hi, John. Thanks for having us.
Anything else you want to say by way of introduction?
As Ann said, I joined her from about 2 years ago after spending about 15 years in the Riverside County District Attorney's Office, prosecuting pretty much exclusively for a decade the sexual assault and child abuse of children. And so when I transitioned to Ann's firm, I started leading the trials as far as the systemic sexual assault problem that, like Ann said, we see in these organizations throughout the country.
Sorry, guys. I muted the video while I poured myself some seltzer water. Oh my God. Okay. What I had said was her experience in Riverside County, California. By the way, Riverside County is where Scientology's international management base is located, out at Gilman Hot Springs, California. Interesting little point there. Okay. So. Okay, this next segment is where we get into some of the finer details. And these details get hit on multiple times in this interview because this is massively important. What actually is trafficking? An organization like the Church of Scientology, when we talk about getting Scientology, when we talk about litigating against Scientology for sex trafficking, it can be hard to actually understand what that means because every Scientologist in the world would literally laugh at you at the idea that that's what Scientology does. I might go so far as to say that a lot of ex-Scientologists would maybe roll their eyes and be like, oh, come on. That's not what happens in Scientology. You know, you think of like some underage ring where like kids are being sold and stuff like this. That's not what trafficking means. And I think you guys are going to be shocked to find out what trafficking actually means, especially when it comes to an organization like, we're talking about the Mormon Church, but on this channel, we're talking about the Church of Scientology. When you have institutional structures in place that are closed, they are not open for inspection from the civil authorities. And when you have systems, structures, policies, procedures, rules in place that prevent abuse of children from being reported to the authorities, and the organization itself benefits reputationally or financially from preventing this information from being made public, you're talking about trafficking. This is what blew my mind the first time I listened to this episode of this podcast. So let's start. We're going to jump forward to 1209. And we're hearing this, guys, from two of the country's leading experts in this subject. And by the way, these attorneys or Ann Andrews was involved in the litigation against the Catholic Church, was involved in the litigation against the Boy Scouts. And by the way, has some amazing anecdotes of how civil litigation does not only result in a monetary result, but actual institutional policy level changes. She gives real examples, which are absolutely fascinating to hear. She's leading the charge in the litigation against the Mormon Church. And someone like Ann Andrews is who is who should be keeping David Miscavige up at night, if you hear what I'm saying. Okay, here we go. Let's do it this way.
But that's not the basis in law for a lawsuit. What we have pled in these complaints are consistent with what you said: serious allegations of sexual abuse within an institution, and the concerns that grow out of those pleadings, and in the ways in which they're filed appropriate under the requirements of law, are such that we can glean from the pleadings and from our investigation, our full investigation of these cases, by an expert here sitting to my left who was trained in this field and tried hundreds of these cases, that we believe that there is a policy, as reflected in the facts of each of the cases on file, that abuse is, as reported to bishops and even higher up, not being reported to the constituent members of the congregations to protect their children, not being reported to police or to law enforcement or to any outside organization that could charge these predators, could protect the community and the congregants, the members of these organizations, these church organizations, and that it is in fact consistently pled that these facts are hidden from public view and handled in a way that allows the abuse, the serious abuse of children, to continue on a wholesale basis, which constitutes trafficking.
Handled in a way that allows the widespread abuse of the children to continue to occur, and that constitutes trafficking. There are so many examples in Scientology of a predator being so-called handled by Scientology procedures and then sent off to another area or another org or another post where they continue to abuse. Again, the authorities are never involved. This is an example of something being handled in a way that allows the widespread abuse of children to continue to occur, and that constitutes trafficking.
From
Sorry.
child to child, from bishop to bishop, there's a that continues that allows the abuse, the serious abuse of children, to continue on a wholesale basis, which constitutes trafficking. From child to child, from bishop to bishop, there's a very strong basis for the pleading in these cases that this is systemic abuse occurring within the church from policy at the very highest levels of the church, and followed by bishops as mandated by handbooks, by the institutional statements of how bishops are required to call a hotline if they receive a report of sexual abuse. They are required to not report it to police, law enforcement, or any other ways in which it would be stopped and prosecuted criminally. And that because of that systemic abuse and because of that policy that is in place every day, has not changed, and I don't know when it started, but I'm sure it's been going on for some time, children continue to be abused in this system of a religious organization that has a closed system. And when we talk about a closed system, what I'm implying is that when you don't have outsiders looking in and you don't have the places, the protections in place that are now instituted nationwide for the protection of children, that mandated reporting, that constant investigation and vigilance, background checks, all the things that other youth organizations are doing and religions are doing to protect children from the predators that abound even still, to gain access to children, that when a closed system such as this institution allows this to continue without outside intervention, policing of their organization with standards that are in place now, it is the type of conduct that allows continued abuse and ongoing abuse of serious sexual assault to its victims, and they're largely children.
Yeah.
So we're here to talk about what we've pled. We're here to explain the context of our methods and our pleadings, what they mean, what they will show, and how we will go forward with them.
Amazing. That describes Scientology to a T. I was shocked to learn here that the Mormon Church actually has a hotline, a phone number, a bat phone, if you will, to call when they become aware of some sort of abuse of children. And that hotline is really, you might be like, oh, wow, they're elevating it to a level where it'll get addressed. No. They're elevating it to a level where it will be kept quiet, be handled, be managed, That is a little different than in Scientology. That is a little different than in Scientology. So in Scientology, there is, to some extent, a pressure not to send bad news up the line. there is a bit of a pressure there. They call it handle and report. Don't just send some information up lines that's alarming and it's a flap, it's a big deal. And so now you're putting it on the shoulders of your seniors to take care of. And it's weird because I actually could argue both ways on this. In many cases, again, L. Ron Hubbard said so much, he spoke out of both sides of his mouth, that you could always seize on one thing he said in one policy to contradict something else he said in another policy. There's some aspect of Scientology policy that's like, withholding vital information from people who need it is also kind of a crime. I'm using that word loosely here. Withholding vital information from seniors is a crime, but also creating a problem and sending a problem up lines without a handling is also a crime. So it's kind of like you're a bit of damned if you do, you're a bit of damned if you don't. But Scientology sure doesn't have a child abuse hotline. That's for sure. And you know, we can't deny the fact that even the head of the Office of Special Affairs, Mike Rinder, has gone on record and claimed that he had no knowledge in his entire history of Scientology of any child sex abuse ever being covered up at any time. So that does beg the question of whether Mike was either lying or whether there were other systems in place to kind of sequester that information. I guess the courts, the courts will have to help us determine the truth in that. But when you talk about this closed system where policies exist from on high that prevent any of this information from being shared with external authorities, and that this fact creates an environment that allows the abuse of children to continue to occur, and that is trafficking, you've described Scientology to a T. Okay, the next 3-minute clip gives a bit more. Oh, it goes right into it. We're going to pick up right where we left off about what constitutes trafficking.
Thank you for that overview. And Kimberly, anything you want to add in terms of the Mormon Church's systemic approach to abuse historically, structurally?
No, as Ann said, we've pled that.
Okay.
The systemic approach in dozens of complaints that we've just filed over the past 2 weeks.
Okay. Colby, want to give you a chance to add anything contextually before we jump into the Bussey case?
Yeah, I think before we jump into the Bussey case, I actually just have a question. Kimberly, since you're the subject matter expert in this field, Ann mentioned that these complaints, or several of these complaints, are premised off of the charge of trafficking, the civil claim of trafficking. Can you explain just at a high level what that would entail, so that as people listen to the facts in the Bussey case, they can have that context?
Sure. So the human trafficking statute is a relatively newer statute that's been implemented in the past couple decades. So unfortunately, when the statute opened up in California, a lot of those older victims were unable to be afforded the opportunity to bring the sex trafficking allegations. Brandon Bussey's complaint was pled human trafficking for several different reasons, but one of the most important being the knowing beneficiary liability, which basically puts the church's organization on notice and holds them accountable for these causes of action. And because Brandon Bussey's case, the conduct is so recent, they are able to plead these causes of action.
Okay, hold on. I have to very quickly catch up on my timestamps here. Oh, so if we're at 1740. Okay, good. No, we got to keep going. All right.
Okay. So if I'm understanding you correctly, because when people hear trafficking, they may have like a layperson's definition of what they think that means. What are some significant hallmarks they should look for as we walk through some of the facts in the complaint that help illustrate that this is trafficking and that this liability attaches to the church?
It's kind of what Ann mentioned a little bit ago. It's the systemic constant covering up. It's facts that lend themselves to a victim being sexually assaulted within an organization. And within that organization, they have knowledge, they have direct knowledge, indirect knowledge, they have a duty to care for the child. And with that knowledge, the organization does nothing. They continue to implement practices and policies that do not allow the victim to report to law enforcement. They don't encourage the abuser to be held accountable by law enforcement. They knowingly cover up a predator and do not protect the children with whom they are interacting with. These types of patterns that you see emerging over years and years can start to raise red flags as to whether or not this is sex trafficking. When the organization is then on top of covering up that sex abuse, obtaining some type of benefit, such as, positive reputation, positive membership, growing membership, because these secrets per se are being kept within the organization, such as child molesters.
Wow. It's astonishing to consider how closely that describes Scientology. This is one of the parts in this interview where I thought Scientology is worse in this regard than any other religious organization, in my opinion, because Scientology doesn't just benefit reputationally and membership-wise from keeping this inside. They literally profit off of it, and not profit through not losing money. I mean, literally profit. Scientology's security checking procedure, which is their interrogation procedure that they use using the e-meter. It's just like an auditing session, but it's being done for justice reasons. Costs $200 an hour at the cheapest, lowest level organizations. And when Scientology gets wind that something like this is going on, they don't turn a blind eye. They go, oh, crimes, we must investigate. We must get to the bottom of this. He must get sec checking immediately at his own expense. We want to know time, place, form, and event, who, what, when, where, why, how many times. We want to know everything. And we're going to videotape it, and we're going to document it in writing, and we're going to share those reports around with other people in the organization. The case supervisor is going to see it. The senior case supervisor is going to see it. The ethics officer is going to see it. You know, the cramming officer is going to see it. The FESer is going to see it. The senior case supervisor is going to see it. The Kant senior case supervisor might see it. The case supervisor and the ethics officer at the nearest advanced org is going to see it. You know, like, it doesn't even get kept secret. I mean, you know, when I say it doesn't get kept secret, I mean, there's going to be this information is not kept very confidential. Now, it's not shouted from the rooftops either. And they charge you $200 an hour for the privilege of being investigated. And this can go on for dozens and dozens and dozens of hours. So Scientology is literally profiting off of the abuse of children. Now, add on top of that the reputational gain that they get from keeping it quiet, the membership, you know, they gain by keeping it quiet prevents them from losing members and all this kind of stuff. Everything she just said applies to Scientology, and then some. Okay, so that took us to 1925. Okay, our next clip actually picks up right where we are. Let's keep going.
Yeah, let me add to that if that's okay. So it's a great question, Colby. And the reason why the federal sex trafficking statute was enacted in 2016. So this is a federal law.
Guys, she just said 2016. That's how recently the federal sex trafficking statute was initiated. Let's hear that one more time.
Yeah, let me add to that if that's okay. So it's a great question, Colby. And the reason why the federal sex trafficking statute was enacted in 2016. So this is a federal law. And we put it under the federal law because it's a systemic type of conduct that you think of when you think of a RICO type of claim, the kind of conduct that constitutes an agreed upon series of transgressions by an institution that constitute criminal conduct, which is set in a civil setting, for using children in a way that is trafficking them for the benefit of an organization.
Wow. I mean, oh God, it's amazing.
And when we mean trafficking, we're talking about the serial abuse of multiples of children governed by the policies institute above them within the church. So when you're allowing multiple victims to be trafficked within a closed organization, it is considered trafficking in the sense that these children aren't being protected. This is conduct that is clearly criminal to know and cover up acts of sexual abuse to children.
See, this is you know, I mean, it blows my mind every time I listen to it, but it's like, I just know there's so many people out there and in our community that would consider sex trafficking to be like, that your policy is literally, that the policy of the organization is like, literally says you're supposed to abuse the kids in these ways. And of course, that's like an absurdly extremist example, you know? When it's like, no. You have an organization where things like this occur, and your policies allow such abuse to continue to occur because your policies prevent any of these predators from actually facing legally accepted, what's the word, like accepting. It can't just be dealt with internally. what's the word? Repercussions is not the word I'm looking. Consequences, legally accepted consequences from external civil authorities. When your policies that come down from on high create a closed system that allows abuse like this to occur, because it prevents any of these predators from being dealt with by the legally accepted external civil authorities, you're trafficking the kids. And that is what I believe most ex-Scientologists hearing this might go, I never actually knew that. I mean, I don't mean to project. I mean, just because that was my reaction doesn't mean it has to be everyone's reaction. But it really is incredible. And if I weren't hearing it from someone who was an expert in the subject, I wouldn't believe it. But these are experts in the subject. And experts like these are what David Miscavige's nightmares are made of. Let's see what else she has to say here.
We have pled them in a civil setting. We are civil lawyers, but the human sex trafficking statute is broadly interpreted across all different kinds of trafficking. We have multiple states involved. We have numerous bishops involved. We have policy coming from, think of it as a corporate structure from the highest levels of a corporation up to its board that are implemented and forced down upon its members. They constitute an enterprise that results in trafficking and the trafficking of children, the movement from children across state lines, the benefit that these churches are from hiding these predators is all pled in these complaints very accurately and will be the subject of the ongoing litigation.
Wow. Moving of the kids across state lines. Now, this is amazing because in Scientology, you get both moving the kids and you get moving the predators. So Matt Pesh has already publicly discussed in at least one video how, as the Treasury Secretary of the Flag Service Organization, in other words, he was in charge of all the accounts, the finance, the books of the Flag land base here in Clearwater, Florida, where I live, when the Office of Special Affairs would become aware that one of their own adult members had sexually abused one of their own child members, they would go to Matt to get a check cut for the airfare needed to get the predator out of the state to another jurisdiction, and also the child. Yeah. Now, the examples that she actually discusses in her lawsuits of the Mormon Church paying for this person to fly here or this person to fly there. This is another example where I'm like, it's even worse in Scientology, because in her examples that she discusses, it's not the Mormon Church flying predators out of the jurisdiction. It's actually the Mormon Church. Let's say at least the one case she was discussing here, flying someone who had been known to be a predator to somewhere else where they then abused someone else. But they pay for them to travel somewhere, but it wasn't for them to get away from the scene of the crime. It was like a church trip, and then the person abused someone else in another country. And so it was all, you could almost say it was incidental. And in Scientology's case, they're literally like, I need a check to get the rapist out of the state. I need a separate check for the child sex abuse victim to also get out of the state. It's even worse in Scientology. Okay, next clip, 2125. We're going to go to 2708. And I don't know why I don't have an end stamp for this clip, but I think it might become apparent. Let's see.
His wife as nothing to be concerned about.
Yeah. And that's a question that I have had, is like, how much did Brendan and his wife know, and when did they know it? And that's so critical, is just this instinct of a Mormon leader to downplay and dismiss behavior, to emphasize repentance and forgiveness and the atonement, but also to work really hard to protect the reputation of the church. Because what would it be if an area authority's son was revealed to be a sexual predator? Could that affect his upward mobility in the church? Could that affect the church's image? Could it become a scandal? So for all those reasons, there would be pressures applied to minimize the behavior, not just to, immediate family, but also to surrounding members of the community, to the ward, to the stake, to people that this son would have continued access to. And for all those reasons, that's where it begins, is the cover up, right?
Okay, good. I remember why I didn't have a timestamp to end this one. So what we just heard It's so interesting because John's a former Mormon. The male lawyer that he also is having the show is also a former Mormon. And it's so easy for them as former Mormons, just like it is for me as a former Scientologist, to slip into trying to describe and explain how a Scientologist or a Mormon would justify why, of course, the right thing to do is to cover this up. And what happens is Ann Andrews, oh my God, she is so sick and tired of hearing religious people explain in religious ways why it's okay to cover up child sex abuse. And she jumps right in a way that is almost offensive, but not really. And she's literally about to cut him off. And before I play her part, I want to bring up the other instance of Scientology literally flying a predator to another area. And we've discussed Johnny Maurer. We've discussed Johnny Maurer on this channel a lot. Johnny Maurer was a Scientology staff member, I think it was in Sacramento, who was found through some, I don't know how it came up. I don't know if it was someone wrote a report on him or if he got it off as an overt and a withhold and an OW write-up, or if it was in an auditing session, that he had actually, as a coach on a baseball team for young boys, been molesting non-Scientologist boys outside of the org. And this came up. And then it also came up that he had been having some illegal sexual, whether it was sexting or what, I don't recall right now, with underage Scientology staff members all over the West US. Because Johnny Maurer was such a good fundraiser that the Scientology actually paid to send him to other orgs all over the West US to help people in those orgs learn how to fundraise. And so many of these fundraisers at these other orgs were underage kids. I realize that's redundant. They were kids. They were underage. They were minors. And he was found. So he was already found. He was already found by the Scientology authorities to be abusing kids inside Scientology and outside Scientology. The abuse was perpetuated by Scientology literally sending him from org to org. And what did they do? They sent him to Clearwater. They sent him to the one city that per capita probably has more Scientology kids than any other city, even Los Angeles. They sent him out of the jurisdiction to another Scientology city chock full of kids. And they secretly declared him. But they allowed him to work at his father, Mike Maurer's business here in Clearwater. They had some weird deal where he could talk to his dad, but only at work. So they had to be disconnected from each other outside of work. Johnny had to be working on his A to E steps, which is how to get back into the good graces of Scientology when you've been expelled. But it was a secret expulsion. It was a secret declare. It wasn't, nobody was told about it. He was still allowed to work at a Scientologist run business. He was allowed to associate with his Scientologist friends. Johnny Maurer's an unbelievable example. And guys, there's another example on my channel. I actually forget the guy's name. It's the only video I've ever done that was removed for privacy violations. Because when you talk about people in Europe, there's extra protections for people in Europe. So there was this Sea Org member, and I'll put his name in the comments section afterwards when I remember what it is. There was a Sea Org member who worked on projects for Scientology's senior organization responsible for all of its computerization. The organization is called INCOM, the International Network of Computerized Organized Management, INCOM. And this Sea Org member was not an official staff member of INCOM, but he was one of these floater Sea Org members. And INCOM would use him for projects because he had the technical skill needed to do these projects. And they would send him, INCOM would send him out on projects by himself, which is actually against normal Sea Org protocol, by himself to orgs all over the world. And for some reason, Instead of putting up in a hotel or something, they would have him stay with Scientologist families. And this Sea Org member would molest their kids. And it was found out that this was happening by a now ex-Scientologist who'd been assigned to interrogate him. It was found out this was happening. It was specifically reported that it was happening. This person went right to the Office of Special Affairs International and reported that it was happening, demanded that he stop being sent out. Scientology continued to send him out anyway to other countries, and he continued to molest Scientologist kids. And he was also found to have illegal, let's say, underage material on his phone that he was also transporting across state lines and country lines. It does not get worse than that. Okay, so after John was, we just finished hearing a minute of John sort of explaining how, you know, active Mormons would have it fully justified why it's the best, what's best for everyone and what's best for the church is for this stuff to be kept quiet and handled internally. Let's see how Anne responds to this.
Well,
That is correct.
we don't, you know, as counsel to this family, we can appreciate your comments, John, about what the effect is of this conduct. But what the law requires is the protection of children. And the law requires it in every setting. And the law requires that children be protected by people and that their judgment about what should happen, particularly people of authority and people in leadership in any organization, be it a school, be it a government, be it a corporation, be it a youth organization, using any means, whether it's a religious purpose or a secular purpose, has no bearing on the fact that this is a violation of the laws that protect our children, and each of them and all of them, and that the continued systematic abuse of a child for whatever gain, as you pointed out, if that's the fact, that he would have gain by doing this is exactly what trafficking is designed to prevent. That people who gain from the assault on children in the fashion that you described, which I can't agree with or disagree with because I haven't established those facts. We'll take the depositions. We'll learn if they're shared what the motive is, but it doesn't really matter. What matters is that the systematic abuse of children within a closed organization constitutes trafficking of the child and the subsequent child and the child after that, that will be harmed and abused by a predator.
I'm going to play that sentence again.
And constitutes trafficking matter. What matters is that the systematic abuse of children within a closed organization constitutes trafficking of the child and the subsequent child and the child after that, that will be harmed and abused by a predator.
The systematic abuse of children in a closed organization constitutes trafficking. That's Scientology, folks. That is Scientology. And it is kind of amazing to look back on and consider all the ways in which we as Scientologists would and did, you know, using the formula of the greatest good for the greatest number and all this kind of stuff. And, you know, we're all Thetans, and we're all Thetans in bodies, and even children are just Thetans in young bodies. And a crime against a child is not really any different than a crime against an adult, because there really are no children. There really are no adults. There are only Thetans. And, you know, the only hope that we as beings have to free ourselves from this prison planet is getting as many people as possible onto and up the levels of the bridge. And so, you know, if if a whole big public hullabaloo, whatever the word is, would be made about this crime, would, you know, bring disrepute to Scientology and prevent people from getting into Scientology and keep people from going up the bridge, or, you know, erode people's trust and faith in Scientology, that would be a crime against humanity now, wouldn't it? I mean, that would be a crime against humanity for the crime against this child to be reported to the authorities, wouldn't it? And boy, did we believe that shit. We sure did. But I'll tell you what, Ann Andrews is sick and tired of hearing people like us explain how people like us thought this was okay. She is sick and tired of it. Okay, this is 2951. All right, she's got some more to go here. Here we go.
And what often happens in these cases is the institution that's being pled about causing these harms to continue wants to blame the predator,
Mm.
right? It's easy to blame the predator and to focus on the predator. And that's a lot of the content that we as lawyers deal with, is the blame on the predator. It wasn't us, it was a predator. These people are like sharks. They can't be controlled. We don't know where they are. Well, that's just not the facts. Trafficking it disregards that. It's the conduct of the behavior of the institution, which you pointed out as a corporation, that condones it by not stopping it. Whatever the benefit is, it's substantial the way you've described it. I can imagine even more things will be discovered about what that might be. But what's limited to the pleadings right now are the trafficking of children by the failure to act responsibly and reasonably and violating of the law.
That blew my damn mind. Because whenever we think about crimes like this, of course we're thinking about blaming the predator. Of course we are. And even when we think about trafficking, I think we tend, I mean, I'll speak for myself, but I think anyone would be forgiven for thinking about the predators are the ones doing the trafficking. And her point is, it's the organization that is benefiting by preventing these predators from being brought to justice, by implementing through policy from on high a closed system that disincentivizes and prevents these crimes from being reported to the actual authorities. And that is the essence of the trafficking. The organizational rules and policies that prevent these predators from being held accountable. That is the essence of the trafficking. And it blows my mind because I never thought about any of this stuff in this way. And the clearer this becomes to me, which every time I listen to this podcast, it becomes more and more clear to me. I go, Scientology is so fucked. They're so screwed and they don't even know it yet. Or maybe they do. Okay, so we're at 30:56. She's got another minute to go on this clip.
That's the essence. Imagine even more things will be discovered about what that might be. But what's limited to the pleadings right now are the trafficking of children by the failure to act responsibly and reasonably and violating of the law. That's the essence of sex trafficking. Continual policy, a continuous policy that affects many children. And when you pull the lens back from this case to many others, you'll see that this is a repeated practice. And it is coming from these quorums, these institutions that are allowing this. So the church is not, or any institution, whether it be a corporation or a school or whatever closed system occurs, a private school this can occur in. Trafficking of children is not limited to what we're pleading about this institution, but it is what has happened here because it's a consistent pattern across the country and perhaps across the world. But we're protecting, and we have the ability to protect through our justice system, those children in this country, in this civil justice system, one of the greatest in the world.
Yeah.
Incredible. Absolutely incredible. Okay, next clip is just about 90 seconds, 33:48. Let's see here.
The results keep happening as a result of this system.
Yeah.
Can I just pull back the lens to a non-Mormon or non-religious view of this? In every case that involves a predator and an organization, be it a school, be it a church, be it a youth organization, be it a Catholic church, there's always an excuse given for a purpose that somehow excuses the behavior to protect a predator. I don't care where you find it. I don't care where it happens. But when it happens and it is excused and it is covered up, and the rationale being whatever Colby has instructed us as part of his journey with this and an understanding of this institution, has no bearing on how the law feels about it.
Sure.
It's not available for excuse, and it is not allowable, and its conduct is reprehensible. And the people who do that continue the trafficking of children. So I refuse to sit in an interview like this and believe that there is not a reason to do it, that people who actually engage in this type of behavior, not a psychologist, I'm not a psychiatrist, but I do not believe the people that do this are wound up in a belief system other than their own personal psychological defects that drive them to make decisions that harm children.
Oh, damn. Shots fired. My understanding of what she just said is the people in these organizations that bend over backwards and come up with all sorts of reasons why that for the sake of the organization, these crimes need to be covered up, are actually themselves covering up for the fact that they are actually just deeply disturbed people who are motivated to perpetuate harm against kids. I mean, that's sort of how I took what she said, is I'm not even buying the fact that the reason these people take actions and implement policies and enforce policies that allow the abuse of children to continue to occur is because they are fundamentally motivated by good intentions. She's like, no, they're evil trash. I love it. Okay, so all right, we're going to jump forward to 5802. And this is where they start talking about one particular example. This only lasts for a couple minutes, of someone being flown to another country where they then abused someone else and how this attaches to the church. Here we go.
The allegations are that Hayden abused this child again, and that he was flown there by the church.
Correct. Yes.
Yeah.
Can you talk, Kimberly, about the significance of the fact that the church, at least as alleged so far, paid for the tickets and flew Brandon and his family to Spain? Why is that so important from the legal theory as the case has been pleaded?
Hayden, right? Hayden or Brandon?
I'm sorry. Well,
both.
the church actually would have paid for both, but I'm wondering if Kimberly can speak to that Christmas flight in December of 2019 and why the church paying for that flight, at least as alleged in the complaint, is such a significant fact for their theory of the case, the trafficking statute.
Well, we're going to struggle with that answer because they're going to have to answer why that happened and why you would move a child out of the country, and knowing that the expectation that you're putting a child in harm's way is something that we'll discover. But to speculate, other than the obvious, the child is now away from American authorities. There is no protection there from what happened in Washington, and the ability, are they required in Spain to report to the Spanish authorities that they brought a predator into their country? These are all very heavy issues because sex trafficking is an international crime, is monitored by many, many international organizations. It's an epidemic in our society, and this knowing act of moving a predator into another country is going to be discussed at a very serious level with consequences and penalty of perjury for the testimony and responses.
And Colby, I think that's a great question. That's exactly what the jury's going to need to decide. Why is that important? That the Mormon church paid for the tickets, housed the family in their mansion in Madrid versus just Kathy and Phil paying for it as mom and dad. I think that's a great fact that the jury's going to have to weigh.
That particular clip reminded me exactly of this Sea Org member, this California-based Sea Org member who was consistently sent as a Sea Org member, travel expenses paid for by Scientology, sent to organizations in Europe where he sexually assaulted Scientologist kids, even though Scientology already knew he had a history of this. I'm also reminded of Alex Jensch. Alex Jensch, who I believe, again, fact check me on this, I might have the ages slightly wrong, but I believe that as a 14-year-old boy, he was raped as a Sea Org member, 14-year-old boy Sea Org member, was raped by a female Sea Org member, perhaps in her 30s or 40s. And Scientology then flew both the predator and the victim out of the jurisdiction. So yes, Alexander Jensch is, of course, no longer with us. And yes. Okay, 10112 is going to be our next timestamp. And here we go.
Matter. Let's just say it's a fact that the church flew Payton to Spain. Does their motive in flying him there matter as it relates to the federal trafficking statute or not? The intent. In other words, let's just say there's a spectrum of intent, and the most horrible place on the spectrum is they wanted Hayden to have a new victim, and so they intentionally fly him to Spain so that he can have a new victim or re-abuse a previous victim. That's like the worst case scenario of intent or motive. Or let's just say they didn't know at all, the people that made that decision, and they're just like trying to help a mission president's family get together over the holidays, and they didn't even know that he was a perpetrator. does that at all matter in a federal trafficking sort of case? And to what extent does it matter?
It's a spectrum. That's a great question.
Right.
The motive, absolutely, if we can prove that and we have facts to support that that was the motive the moment they got on the plane, they knew this child was going to be sexually abused, correct. But we go back to 2014, and that's where the motive and intent really begin, and the
Nice.
pattern and practice that emerges, knowing that you're exposing the mission president's young minor children to be in close quarters with a sexual predator, and what benefit did the church receive from making it appear that it was just a mission president's family getting together versus a tarnished reputation for the church. So motive is a sliding scale that is heightened along the way with facts. Not so much on other years, but it's a sliding scale that is consistent from the beginning until the end of the abuse.
So what I would say is, if you think of motive and intent as a difference, as more of a criminal type of proceeding, so intent is required for many kinds of crimes. We have the concept of grossly negligent, right? That can be a criminal kind of negligence. If you think of someone who gets behind the wheel horribly drunk and does horrible things with the vehicle, people lose lives. But in the trafficking statute, it's the action, it's the facts of what was done. The intent will be important to facts to share with the jury, but it's what was done as much as what was intended to do, because the consequences of moving predators around and having them be abused by having them be available, having other children be available for abuse and covering it up, not managing it, not controlling it, not acting reasonably, not following the law. Those are the things that the trafficking statute focuses on. But what you're suggesting is certainly an absolutely horrible thought, but it's all an if, and I'll leave it at that.
That to me was also incredible. That I think I might be touching on something they mentioned later, but intent tends to come very much into play when you're talking about criminal prosecutions. It's the difference between manslaughter and murder 1, murder 2, murder 3, and that kind of stuff. But that the trafficking statutes focuses on actions and results and not intent. And that is very eye-opening. In Scientology, you had, in the Sea Organization, you had the RPF, the Rehabilitation Project Force, which is where they would take Sea Org members who had committed crimes that you might normally be expelled for, but instead of expulsion, they're given the opportunity, as a Scientologist would describe it, to go through the Rehabilitation Project Force. And so in the Sea Org, where they have a much more puritanical view of sex, if a Sea Org member was found to have sexually abused a child, they would be sent to the RPF. But there were also children on the RPF. And so that created a situation where known child abusers were put into an environment with other children who were going through the same sort of punishment and reconditioning camp. And of course, in the Sea Org, in Scientology for sure, but even more so in the Sea Org, there's no such thing as a child. So that's an example where you could go, okay, but Scientology didn't put them all together with the specific intent of furthering the abuse. And the trafficking statute would go, we don't care about the intent. We care about the action. We care about the action. Okay, the next section that we're going to jump to, this is very important when it comes to Scientology, because this has to do with people in the Mormon church being excommunicated for certain crimes. And the attorney talks about how, there's a whole excommunication process. There's hearings, there's files, there's documentation, and we're going to be requesting those. Oh my God. If you think you've got files and documentations and hearing in the Mormon church, wait until you hear about Scientology. Oh my God. Courts of ethics, committees of evidence, ethics interviews, OW write-ups, sec checks, session worksheets, session KRs. Man, it's raining documents. Okay, let's see. 11947 is going to be this clip. And this is, again, just a couple minutes long. Here we go.
Quick question. Did I hear either of you say that Payton was excommunicated? Is there any indication that Payton was ever disciplined by formal church discipline?
We have no information that he was
know.
ever excommunicated.
But there's no indication that he was.
We are not aware of any, but the files on these facts are well, we know where they are. We know that they're comprehensive. We know that we've learned that people are, the manner in which people are excommunicated or severed, or however the church thinks of that, is a process that has a committee, that has findings, that has investigations, and those files will be requested, and we'll learn a great deal.
I just want to note that historically, the Mormon Church appears to have a long history of not excommunicating sexual predators unless public pressure forces them to do so. But the default is to not excommunicate child abusers, pedophiles, etc. And yet they have a history of excommunicating people like Sam Young, who's a former Mormon bishop, who stood up to try and lead a movement to protect children from sexual abuse. Sam Young was excommunicated. Natasha Helfer, a mental health professional who advocated for children, she was excommunicated. And yours truly was excommunicated, not for sexually abusing kids, but for criticizing the church for how they treated children. So there's this weird, potentially continuing disparity or mind-blowing problematic behavior of the church excommunicating honest critics and not excommunicating perpetrators. So that it.
Yeah. You could see him getting a little choked up there. Yeah. That's exactly the point in my speech in front of the LAPD commission. That I got choked up at. Because there's something about having to say it out loud. In front of strangers. That kind of brings into focus like a real sense of shame. That such a thing could be true about an organization we really believed in. And there's just something about saying it out loud in front of strangers that really hits in a way completely different than just knowing it's true. That in Scientology, raping someone does not necessarily get you expelled. But reporting that rape to the police 100% does. That's crazy to come to terms with. How can how I can, or any of us could have, like, actually been a part of an organization that would actually behave that way, that would actually have such a rule, that where the members of that organization would actually have rationalized for themselves how this makes sense on some level, And I remember the first time I saw Going Clear was actually in a movie theater. And I knew all those people, and I knew all of those stories, or some version of them. And there's none of those stories, if they had been told to me in private, in my home, even by the person whose story it was, none of those stories would have gotten me emotional. And yet, hearing those stories in public, in a room full of strangers, I was basically just like sobbing for 2 hours, you know? So, okay. We're going to jump forward to 138. They start talking about more of the litigation strategy, and they start talking about consolidating all of these cases. And it's interesting because consolidating all the cases doesn't make them a class action lawsuit. I might have my terminology here wrong, but my understanding is there's a difference between a mass tort and a class action lawsuit. And they're talking about sort of the efficiencies that come about through consolidating these lawsuits. And I'm skipping through a lot of the discussion that they have on this subject, but there's a particular section that I thought was interesting where they talk about why would the Mormon Church oppose consolidation of these lawsuits? And I just thought this was an interesting section, considering how it applies to Scientology. And I wanted to share it with you. This particular section is about 7 minutes long. It's a little lengthy, but I really want to share it. So 138. Here we go.
So that everybody gets to the justice point at the same time, but in the same way, in an organized and economical, fair process.
Let me ask a question of Colby that y'all can answer if you want, but for some reason I feel like I shouldn't ask you this question directly. Colby, what could you suspect would be the reasons why the Mormon Church would find it disadvantageous to consolidate the cases? And conversely, from the standpoint of the victims, why could you imagine it or speculate it being advantageous for the victims to have these cases consolidated? And then if y'all want to opine on that, you can, but for some reason I felt like I shouldn't ask you that. Go ahead, Colby.
Well, I'll actually
let Colby go first.
Okay.
Well, and I actually think they'll be fine to answer this question because I think I can abstract it away from these cases that we're talking about and just say the premise behind consolidation is, as Ann and Kimberly have both talked about.
From the standpoint of the
What
victims,
just happened?
why could you imagine it or speculate it being advantageous for the victims to have?
I don't know why that just happened, you guys.
Fine to answer this question because I think I can abstract it away from these cases that we're talking about and just say the premise behind consolidation is, as Ann and Kimberly have both talked about, or coordination, this type of coordination, coordinated litigation, is to speed up the process and to not have disparate results on common questions of law and fact. So from the church's perspective, I completely agree with Ann's comments about our litigation system. It's the best one we've got, and I still believe in it with all of my lawyerly heart. And from the church's perspective, litigation, in many cases, litigation is about money. It's about who can prove these facts, who can gather these facts through depositions, through the discovery process. That takes a lot of time and it takes a lot of money. So from the church's perspective, how much a plaintiff has to spend to prove their case is always, and this is not common just to the church, it's to every defendant. Anyone who's defending a case, it's going to be more advantageous for all of those plaintiffs having to individually prove all of those questions of fact and have those legal arguments on those issues when they arise. From a plaintiff's perspective, again, separated from the merits of these cases, this speeds up that process. It allows for there not to be disparate results on those common questions of law or fact, which really shouldn't be occurring anyways. And so it does shortcut. I don't want to say shortcut because they still have to be proved, but those common questions only have to be proved once instead of repeatedly over and over and over again in each of these 100 cases.
So it's potentially faster and cheaper for the victims to have these cases consolidated. Is that what I just heard?
Well, that's what I think that he's suggesting, but it's the cost efficiency of everyone.
But I'm particularly interested in the victims.
So yes,
By the way, one of the reasons I really wanted to share this segment was for the benefit of any ex-Scientologist out there that could potentially participate in litigation such as this against Scientology, but is very much concerned about the process itself and what it might include and what they might have to experience and go through. And I feel like they just do a really good job here of explaining the strategies that they have employed so far in the almost 30 lawsuits against the Mormon Church to make it as easy as possible and efficient as possible. That's one of the reasons I'm playing this part.
System overall.
It's cost efficient for them.
Okay.
And it's also fair for the victims. These are victims of extreme abuse. Their psychological well-being is our responsibility. We brought these claims forward, and we believe through a series of protocols. Let's just say, for instance, depositions are very challenging for some of our clients, right? We know how difficult it is. They're willing to go through them, but the law protecting the rules of engagement of a deposition must be understood and agreed to. So simple things that get, orders of protocol of electronic discovery that you probably would find in your bailiwick, ESI, how documents are stored, where they're kept, how we have access to them. An enormous library of materials will come forward available to all who are in the case now and may join the case later. It's not a closed case. It's open to other people. People may come forward. So a protocol for deposing the victim of severe sexual abuse might not be well understood by a lawyer up in Siskiyou County who might have a very aggressive style of taking a deposition that could be harmful to a person who's experienced such abuse. And trauma-informed counsel such as our firm and others, it's not really my job, though I often have to teach that lawyer how to handle a deposition in a manner in which is fair. It comports with the law. It comports with the clients and their privacy, or the concerns about not being inflammatory, accusatory, attacking, the things you think about that you see on TV, the kinds of cross-examination techniques that can be very damaging.
Right.
They're not fair. So what happens is a deposition protocol that establishes how you conduct yourself in a deposition, how long it is, who can be present, who asks questions, how many breaks you can take. Things that are just civilized and supported in law, but not always followed in 29 counties over dozens of depositions. My conduct as well of taking their depositions. All these things are well understood. Ground rules are established by judges according to the needs of the case.
Okay, so maybe it allows as many victims as possible to get the best possible representation. That's kind of what I'm hearing, and treatment during the process.
I think that's a main concern of ours. It's different for every case, right? Coordinations are very different depending on but what we will seek to achieve is fact discovery, right? That's what we talked about earlier. What happened to this person? What happened to this victim? Questions that'll be answered, what we call a standard series of questions that we develop and we negotiate with all the parties. A fact sheet. It's a universal document that's used for every case. And a fact sheet then gives the judge an expression and an answer to all common questions with a penalty of perjury answer from a client, so that's the same set of questions that every client gets, and it's negotiated, understood, and we are open and require under the coordination statutes and proceedings to meet and confer with the other side. It's not just catastrophic, epic theater of war bombing of each other. It has a controlled, effective manner of moving the litigation forward. Our depositions of the church officials involved, and how these policies occurred. There'll be one set. They'll be handled by the lawyers representing all of the leaders, which is myself and a lawyer in another firm. We'll be taking those depositions, a group of us, about how the policies came to be, what they mean, how they're implemented, all the things that that are common issues about the policy of reporting or failing to report sexual assault to children.
Okay, good. Now that is the end of the clip, but the very next clip carries on right from here. And it's basically, why would the Mormon Church have a problem with this? And I left this in there because you could say the exact same thing about Scientology. Let's check it out.
Okay, Colby, if it's okay, let's flip it now. You could imagine a scenario where the Mormon Church would be thrilled to have all these cases rolled up into one, so they could just focus all their efforts on beating one case, so to say, one initiative, and that defeats all the cases underneath. So why would the Mormon Church oppose the consolidation? Why would it be against their interest? In speculating.
Well, I completely agree with everything Ann said. I don't think there's a whole lot of, and I haven't read the briefing on that issue from the church or listened to the arguments. But if I'm guessing, it's mostly because litigation is expensive. The church is aware of this. I know Tim Kosnoff, who you've hosted before, John, has talked about the church's litigation tactics and the way that they seek to bury these cases early. And I think that the reality is this coordinated litigation will not really allow those same tactics to fly. I know Ann and Kimberly probably can't comment on that, but that would be my guess. But I want to be clear that I'm purely just guessing.
So what I'm hearing is that if the church has $250 billion, they can spend infinite amount of money to bury individual smaller lawsuits.
Well,
potentially.
Sorry to interrupt.
And that's a tactic that it might use to gain advantage over smaller, more vulnerable victims, whereas that they're not going to as easily be able to use those tactics with potentially better representation at a higher level. Is that what you're saying, Colby?
And to go directly to the example that Anne gave, one example I would give of that is the depositions of the church officials. So at the higher levels, obviously depositions are going to have to happen for all of the bishops or stake presidents or direct church leaders who are involved. But at the higher levels, as far as like the church's systemic policies and how the systemic policies either address or don't adequately address mandatory reporting requirements or lapses in mandatory reporting requirements, if all these cases were separate, if there were 100 different cases, every single plaintiff is going to have to go to the cost and expense of deposing that person every single time, is the way it would work. Whereas in this coordinated litigation, that will only have to happen once. And
that's right. So imagine if Mike Ellis, the international justice chief, just has to be deposed once, and then that deposition gets to be used in every lawsuit that's been consolidated. That would be pretty awesome.
And that cost is going to fall on the plaintiffs or the plaintiff's law firm. Whereas here now it will only have to happen that one time.
The only thing I would say is that that's not anything special to this case. I mean, with reference to the 7th Amendment again, I mean, law firms like ours can bring an individual, the least of us, can get the most justice. So our civil justice system and our law firm in particularly, we face this in every case. This is not auto v auto, accident out on your highway here. These are issues of large consequence to our clients. And we take on cases involving the biggest defendants in the world, and the country, if not the world. And so Colby's description of the outsized, or your description rather, of the outsized aspect of this, the church being so much larger than us, we handle that every day. And that's something that, the justice system protects an individual case to be able to have the right to do that. So we feel, and I feel as a bar leader and as somebody who understands the complexities of litigations and the burden on the courts, that the statute was enacted for a reason. And the Supreme Court wanted this to unburden the court. So like I said, 29 counties were involved. And
so that ruling came from the California Supreme Court.
It came from the petition is filed with the Supreme Court. It is heard by the court in which we've requested the petition, which was the Superior Court judge in Los Angeles. She has, and it's a woman who heard it, a very prominent judge and very smart, accomplished judge. And it's just such a practical thing.
Yeah,
I mean, it's
it makes sense.
no, I want the court system. She manages the biggest courthouse in the country, the Los Angeles Stanley Moss Courthouse. She was the presiding judge of it and just came back to the bench. So the common sense of this is really what predominated in the argument.
Yeah.
Like, why wouldn't you want
Makes
this?
sense.
Well, they had their reasons. But we take on large cases. We take cases on against large defendants all the time.
Is it likely the Mormon Church will appeal this ruling, or is it something that really can't be appealed in terms of the California consolidation?
I think I'm a little baffled by that, because I don't know of the multitude of cases that have been coordinated that there has been an appeal. I believe they can appeal, but the discretion of the Supreme Court assigning it for hearing, and the fact of the petition being granted, that the petition being granted is, I'm sure, appealable. I'm a little stumped here. It's sort of like, why would you appeal it?
Yeah.
But the case would not be stayed.
It's certainly
Right.
not something it appears like you're worried about.
You could no.
Okay.
If they appealed it to the Supreme Court and said, we want to stop the proceedings while we spend years getting this case, getting your discretion to tell us we should coordinate this statute that is very strong in its applicability to a case just like this. If it happens, it happens. But I seriously doubt the case will stop.
If there are other
Yeah, that's what I loved, is that it's actually the California Supreme Court that wants cases like this to be consolidated. And the Scientology, like, if anyone's going to appeal, it's going to be Scientology, and they do that as a delay tactic. And her point is, something like this being appealed, like, sure, you can appeal anything, but they're not going to put anything on stay pending appeal. I mean, you see Scientology routinely gets 1 year delays just by putting in notification of appeals and then waiting until the last possible day to submit their appeal. Or more recently, filing them 30 to 60 days late and then just asking for an extension after the fact and being granted extensions. So anyway, I thought that was super, super interesting. Okay, now the next clip, this is about 4 minutes long. This gets to the crux of the issue that I think Scientology is going to fiercely defend. And that's whether they have a mandate to report abuse that they become aware of. And she addresses this directly. 15215. Here we go.
YouTube before we move on to the federal.
I,
No,
I
I
do
would
have a
just say,
Go ahead, Colby.
Well, I do just have a question about something that Ann mentioned, and I particularly am interested in Kimberly's perspective on this. So, one issue that recurrently comes up in these cases is mandatory reporting laws. Can you, one, maybe dispel some common myths that people will hear when mandatory reporting is brought up? So, for example, I know one thing that church lawyers have been in the news for having told, and Mike Resendez brought this to light with Merrill Nelson, a lawmaker in Utah, in the case involving the children in Bisbee, Arizona, which is on appeal. One thing that comes up is that the church lawyers occasionally have represented that mandatory reporting exemptions mean that church officials or church leaders cannot advise police or child protective services of these types of cases. Can you maybe speak to that from your experience as a career prosecutor on these types of cases, and talk about how mandatory reporting exemptions or mandatory reporting laws or exemptions kind of fit into your cases in California before we talk about the multi-district litigation issue?
Sure. The mandatory reporting laws across the states are pretty clear. If somebody's being injured sexually, or if there's a imminent death present, that they're not exempted from reporting state by state. I have heard that the church advises their members that they're unable to report, but that's one of the very issues why we need coordinated proceedings. So we have one judge deciding each incident that they try to raise that they didn't need to report, that they didn't have the duty to report. We don't have a judge in Southern California saying they did have a duty to report, and then a judge in Northern California saying they didn't have a duty to report. It's all encompassed in one area, one judge, one proceeding, where we put this issue at rest for all the plaintiffs across California. The mandatory reporting has evolved over the years. It is an area of law that probably in the mid 90s has really gained traction, and it's been very well litigated, very well revised, and it's clear that you do have a mandatory reporting when you are in certain positions of authority, such as clergy, teachers, coaches, and I believe each year it gets more expansive as far as who's required to report.
So how would an exemption from a mandatory reporting law fit into this? And does California have one of those?
California does not have an exemption. So it would be defense arguing that there was an exemption and plaintiff arguing there was not. And that's the only real way I see it fitting into California's litigation. Our statute is very, very clear, and has been for some time, since 1996, as to reporting requirements, what they entail. They've evolved from telling your immediate supervisor to reporting to law enforcement, and then now reporting directly to child protective services, and who must report if they are given this information.
Yeah, and I understand those are always going to vary state by state. Some states do have an exemption. Some states mandate reporting for all adults, where other times it's maybe someone who's kind of in a trusted role, a contact point with children in society, like you talked about, teachers, coaches, clergy. Do you know, is there any mandatory reporting exemption or any mandatory law in any of the 50 states that would prohibit the church, in a case like any of the ones we've discussed today, from reporting that to authorities?
I'm unaware of any.
but what I would say is that, one of the issues that would be of great interest to both sides is what are the layers of what mandatory reporting is required, or reporting even to your congregation to protect children. I mean, these are the layers of the onion that'll be peeled back legally. Once we find out what happened and why it happened the way it did, we will be able to examine with a very close microscopic legal lens whether it followed the law or not.
Incredible. Do you know who's never been tested in a court of law as to whether, Scientology's never even been in a position where they were having to defend themselves against accusations of violating mandatory reporting laws. And that is why this is going to, this is black and white. This is clear cut. Scientology's never been litigated from this angle. They've never been litigated against from this angle before. Okay, the next segment here is about 5 minutes long, and it has to do with the legal strategy of doing anything and everything possible to avoid being subject to discovery. That is, of course, describing Scientology's litigation strategy to a T, and the pros and cons of settlements, and what kind of institutional policy level change you can actually bring about through civil lawsuits. Okay, this is 15950, and this is fascinating stuff here. Here we go.
Many of these cases work is, number one, in terms of like victory, oftentimes a goal can be just getting past discovery. So it's assumed that the church is going to try and get this thrown out in some sort of pretrial motion, summary judgment sort of thing. And it'll do that at least in part because the last thing it wants to do is provide documentation of the evidence of what happened behind the scenes, what conversations happened by the church, by its law firms, by its PR representatives. My understanding is the Mormon Church will do almost anything to avoid being opened up to the discovery process. So if you're able to surmount the initial attempts to have the case thrown out, then the most likely scenario for how this resolves is it gets right up to the point where the Mormon Church thinks it's going to be subject to discovery, and then it's going to settle because there's no way it wants to open up its kimono. So that's my understanding. And then also there are benefits to that because sometimes you can get a very large settlement for minimal effort. So that can benefit the victims because you get a very large settlement without having to be drugged through depositions and a hearing and trial, and then risking a verdict that may or may not go their way. Some people don't like the idea of settlements in these types of cases because ultimately, number one, settlements are often private, so you never know what was settled and why and what the damages were. But then also, I guess organizations like the Mormon Church, if a settlement happens, they're never quite exposed or held accountable for what they did. It's all it's all secret because the settlement's secret, and that's part of what the church pays for when they do a settlement, is ultimately not a guilty verdict. Anything you want to say about that?
It's just, look, there are pressure points in every case, whether it's a pharmaceutical case or, I just tackled the Sacklers and one of the biggest catastrophes in our American existence of what happened in the opioid, the process to market opioids that weren't addictive. I mean, these kinds of high profile cases that affect people in the most horrible ways, children, one of the concepts here is that this is an ongoing problem. That's why you asked us here, right? This isn't one set of cases. This isn't one. It would not be it'd be interesting, but it wouldn't be compelling if it was just a discrete group of people who are going to bring their case to justice and are going to get what the law allows. This is an ongoing problem. And I can't speculate how the church is going to handle it. I don't think you can. You probably do, but I don't think it would be, I don't think we know.
No, of course not.
And what I really want to say about settlement is an individual client's decision. Each one of these people that have come forward with the courage that it takes to do so, and what we know about victims of sexual assault and the challenges that they face, and how incredibly courageous it is, will be handled individually for their best interests in what they require. And I can tell you that, he may be listening in, but I've had some very, very emotional conversations with a client who says that he believes God put him here to put this right and to see to it that the bishop, for what this bishop did, allowing him to be abused, his brother to be abused, and another relative of the predator to be abused, going on, I think it was over 15 years. This group of boys in this particular ward were abused by the same man with two bishops who knew it. He's not going to take it, and he's a member of the armed services. He's a patriot. He's a Mormon, and listening to him and the effect that it has on me as his carrier for justice, as his advocate for justice, is going to be very important to him. And as of now, when clients have to be explained what it means to go through this, they have to take on the responsibility with us as counsel that's what they want. Nobody gets dragged into court. This isn't a criminal proceeding. These people want this. So it's very much what they want, John, and what justice means for them and what the resolution means for them. And there are other aspects to resolution that you haven't even talked about. You've only probably suggested money as a resolution. There are policies they're resolutions of other things. If the church came to the table and wanted reform, imagine what that would mean. We have to prove what they need to do. They're not going to, it's not a hearing for them before Congress to be exposed about, practices that violate the sex trafficking laws. But if they want reform, it's in their hands. But it's in our clients and in their decision for what they want from their lawyers. They tell us. We don't tell them.
That's a great clip. Okay, the next one that I had queued up, I'm going to skip. They talk about the federal statutes, how it's relatively new. Only a couple hundred cases have even litigated using the federal trafficking lawsuits, not just sex trafficking, but other human trafficking and labor trafficking and all sorts of stuff. She explains how when you do this consolidation of the cases in the state of California, you also have cases that you can bring in the state of California that are brought at the federal level, where they're being brought in the federal district that California is a part of. And she talks about how, you can only do the case either has to be a state case or it has to be a federal case. You can't have one case that's both. But that when you do the consolidation in the way that they do it, the judge overseeing the state cases can talk to the judge that's overseeing the federal cases. And she just talks about some of the more efficiencies that exist in the way that they go about this stuff. Here's what's interesting. The timestamp that we're going to jump forward to talks about, it's a question about the federal church autonomy doctrine and what her thoughts are on how everything that's being talked about here is not protected under the federal church autonomy doctrine. So I looked that up really quick, and it says the federal church autonomy doctrine is a legal principle in the U.S. that protects the self-governance of religious institutions from government interference. Rooted in the First Amendment of the Constitution, specifically the Free Exercise Clause and the Establishment Clause, it ensures that religious organizations have the freedom to manage their internal affairs, including matters of doctrine, governance, membership, and the selection and management of clergy without state intervention. The doctrine recognizes that churches and other religious entities have a sphere of authority separate from secular government control. It prevents courts and government officials from entanglement in ecclesiastical disputes, such as those involving theological beliefs or internal church policies, thereby preserving religious liberty. For example, under this principle, courts typically abstain from adjudicating cases that would require them to interpret religious doctrine or override a religious organization's decision about its ministers or members. This doctrine is what has prevented the courts from interpreting Scientology policy to determine whether the arbitration clause is conscionable or not. In other words, whether Scientology's internal religious arbitration is conscionable, except in the is it the Bixler lawsuit? Except in the Bixler lawsuit, one judge did issue a preliminary ruling that Scientology's arbitration procedure was in fact unconscionable, but that judge was then removed from the case before he could publish that ruling. The new judge has not yet had an opportunity to adopt the previous judge's tentative ruling. Anyway, I'm getting off the beaten path a little bit. So, but this doctrine has very much come into play in Scientology's favor in litigation up until this point. It does say here, the essence of federal church autonomy doctrine balances the separation of church and state, ensuring that religious organizations can operate according to their own faith while limiting the government's role to secular matters. However, it is not absolute. Courts can intervene in cases involving civil harms like fraud or physical abuse if they can resolve them without delving into religious questions. Okay, so let's hear Anne's answer. This is a very funny answer. At 2:16:46. Pause. 2:16:46. Here we go. This is a very, very short clip.
Gerardo is asking, why do you strongly believe that the federal church autonomy doctrine does not apply in this case? He's assuming you don't think it applies. That's kind of a cold out of the blue question, but any thoughts on that? Church and state.
So, this is the legal tangle that we find ourselves in. Is there autonomy for any organization? And if you are going to say that church autonomy that will allow systematic abuse against children is a purpose of that particular theory, I would say, I think what will bear out is that it will be likely intolerable for any judicial system to believe that the constant, pervasive, and ongoing systematic abuse is the result of a policy of any organization that continues to allow the abuse of children cannot be held accountable under the laws of this country. And I would find it though I won't be surprised, I would not want to make that argument. And I've taken both sides of issues throughout my career. I would not want to be trying to make that argument.
I love how she's kind of like, as a lawyer, you can in good faith argue both sides of many or most issues. But when it comes to the issue of whether church autonomy allows you to implement policies that permit the systematic and systemic prolonged abuse of children, I wouldn't want to make that argument. Okay, the next question, similar sort of topic of what about the Supreme Court? Supreme Court leaning very heavily Catholic. What about the idea that the Supreme Court the Supreme Court will intervene to protect religious protections, even at the cost of children, perhaps? Let's see what her answer is here. This is another very short answer. 22106. Here we go.
A couple questions that come to my mind really quick as we're kind of wrapping up here. One is, it's my guess is the United States Supreme Court, as currently constituted, is heavily religious, by the way, heavily Catholic, by the way. And we all know the Catholic Church, with its spotlight sort of past, has a history of, as found in court, of protecting and relocating abusing priests at the expense of victims. And we know that the current U.S. Supreme Court is highly religious and highly Catholic constructed. There probably would be people who would worry that maybe with today's Supreme Court, any ruling against a church has a high probability of being overturned in the Supreme Court, because the Supreme Court would likely be inclined to protect religious liberty and, frankly, just to protect the interests of churches, especially prominent, wealthy churches. I don't even know if y'all would be in a position to comment on that or speculate on that, but obviously that comes to my mind in 2025.
I would simply say that the earlier question about church autonomy doctrine applying to this, I will say the same thing. Of all the Supreme Court high flyers that I know, and I know many of them, the one that argued, Harrington versus Purdue against the large structure that we use to punish the Sacklers through the bankruptcy process, it was a pretty difficult argument. There are difficult arguments for these Supreme Court high flyers. They take on these challenges. The cases that are argued, there was one of them that appeared in the tithing case recently, very prominent one, Paul Clements. I think talking about the difference between money and church autonomy, about where they put their money and the discretion that autonomy might allow to money, I would not want to be arguing that such autonomy would allow crimes against children on a systematic basis. I will say again, I would not want to have the challenge of making that argument to any court, and even this Supreme Court.
Again, short and sweet. Be like, yeah, I wouldn't want to be that lawyer. Okay, we're down to the last few short clips here. In fact, there's even one that I'm going to skip just for brevity. Okay, this next clip, this is about 3.5 minutes long. This has to do with actually getting meaningful, structural, institutional, policy level changes made in these organizations that actually protect children. And I think that is a really good message to hear. These lawsuits are not all about money. And I think it's good to hear the perspectives directly from the lawyers who are fighting these battles. So this is 2, 2, 3, 4, 5, 2, 2, 3. Oh, I guess we're pretty much right there, weren't we? Yep, we sure were. All right, here we are.
Goals might be to get the Mormon Church to change its policies to do a better job of protecting its most vulnerable members. Are y'all in a position now to just sort of list what some of the recommendations from a constructive standpoint you might have to the Mormon Church to do a better job of having its perpetrators achieve justice and accountability, and also of its victims to be protected better?
And protect the integrity of the culture of a religion, of people who have, following in the numbers of 5 million in America. I mean, look, most people who know my background, I didn't talk about it very much, but I was one of the principal negotiators of the National Boy Scout bankruptcy settlement that did mandate through a survivors committee that mandated reform within the Boy Scouts, used policies that are now instituted nationwide in youth groups and followed by churches, by youth groups and schools, systematically for the safety of children. We want children to be able to go to programs. We want them to be able to go to camps. We want them, and the Mormon Church has many common things. And a matter of fact, there were 500,000 Boy Scouts that were in Mormon programs at one time. There are very safe, practical systems in place in organizations and churches included that if they chose to follow them, they could be enacted easily. Why they don't is going to be up to them to explain to a jury. If they came to us and said, "And we'd like to sit down with you, and as part of the resolution of this case, enact policies that we would like to change the way the church operates up to the apostles and quorum levels, and see to it that it has real teeth, and see to it that it has real reporting, like the Boy Scouts has now, because of this group that grew out of the bankruptcy formed by my firm and other firms, a coalition of firms that protect youth activities and scouting." That's in their world. It's not, I mean, imagine if something like that were to happen. Imagine if I could be proud as I was of what we accomplished in Boy Scouts, that a church came forward, and it grew out of some horror and some harm to children, that the future of children would be a safe place in your church and this place. So it's theirs to choose. And I think that as long as they don't change it, this litigation is not going to stop. It's going to continue. And cases are occurring. The tragedy, and to anybody watching who has any sort of influence or communication with the people who are making these decisions within church policy, it can be stopped. And why it's not being stopped is what they must ask themselves. And I think that I think there are good people in all organizations. And whatever caused this, and whatever outmoded way of doing things, the way the Catholic Church did in Spotlight, have now changed. So join us in that challenge. Come to the table and make it known that you can change. But we can't let it go, because it's a boy or a girl will be assaulted each day and every day until the policy changes.
In the Mormon Church.
Yeah, that was a great clip. And, the next clip that I have is the one that I think I'm going to skip, even though, I actually have a link to this whole original interview in the description down below. And I want to call out this clip. I'm not going to play it right now because it's 7 minutes long. It's the longest clip I have so far. The timestamp of it is 2 hours, 33 minutes and 30 seconds, and it runs to precisely 2 hours and 40 minutes mark. And the question that John basically poses is, people have the idea about lawyers and litigation, that it just comes down to the money. And he says, what do you guys have to say about that? And what they each have to say about that, and what they each have to say about the cases they've taken on and the causes they've taken on in their history is it's quite inspirational. And I originally wanted to include it because it's sort of a 7-minute segment that if you were a former Scientologist wondering whether these were the attorneys you might want to work with, I just thought it was an incredible segment, and I might publish it separately, but for the sake of time, I'm going to skip it right now. It is 7 minutes long. So the next very, very short clip is her giving another example of how civil litigation brings out actual meaningful change that saves lives. 2, 4, 3, 30. And okay, here we go.
When they are committing sexual assaults with young minor children, I think that's a problem.
Got it. Okay.
I'm thinking of one last thing that I think might help your viewers understand how change can be accomplished through litigation. And whatever people think about shedding people in negative light. One of my mentors was a great attorney named Mark Robinson. And when I was a young lawyer, still in law school, as a matter of fact, he was one of the first great auto product liability lawyers, which tried the issue of safety of cars, which in the 70s, which this era of car, the Pinto, was made. And he was the one that found the smoking gun document that a board of directors and a whole team of managers decided that $1.99 to reinforce a gas tank was not enough to save lives, that people would perish in rear-end collisions in Ford Pintos and be burnt alive. And as a result of people like that, the automobile industry completely changed the way. And if we think about being exposed to predators and going to church and all the ways in schools you might be exposed to predators unknowingly, every time you got in a car, every time you got in a Ford Pinto, you were risking your life in a collision. And that man changed the way cars were made. And this woman changed the way the Boy Scouts operates a youth program. And this woman would like to change many institutions' ways to better protect children. But that litigation is what brought that to light. That document would never have been known. It was a document that was covered extensively, that a memo was sent that said $1.99 times however many hundreds of thousands of cars they made was not going to be paid to save lives. That's exactly what they said in the memo. It was too expensive to share up the gasoline, the gas tanks of a Ford Pinto that had incredible risk of being rear-ended, of people burning to death. So I hope that, you know, over the time of my career, these changes have been brought in my cases. I'm not going to, you know, describe them all here today, but this is the kind of thing that litigation does, and this is why trial lawyers are very respected, admired, and to be thought of as heroes. And that's what we hope to accomplish, is a heroic thing here. And if I can be the change that Mark Robinson got, that Ford, that made all those vehicles safe and eventually took them off the road, if I can do something similar for the youth of the Mormon religion, I hope it's me.
That's pretty strong. That is pretty powerful. Okay, last 4-minute clip, and then we're gonna go to the starred comments. So the this clip is really John asking the attorneys what advice they have to victims in deciding whether to prosecute or litigate, whether to cooperate and participate in litigation such as this. And I just thought this was so powerful that I wanted to share this. So 2, 4, 6, 10. Oh, are we already there? Oh, good Lord. We're already there. All right, here we go.
Beautiful. Last question. It's always a complicated situation for a victim to decide whether or not they want to prosecute. There are so many victims of assault or rape don't report. I've heard it as low as 1%. But regardless, is there anything? I assume that if somebody either has a case, federal or state, or if they have a situation that could become a case, they have to make that difficult decision of whether or not they want their case to be potentially made public. Do y'all have anything to say to any victims out there who are trying to make that very difficult decision about whether or not to prosecute?
Sure. So, you know, it's obviously a decision that is best made with the support of family. Having people standing with you to help you through that, because you will suffer. Our clients do expose themselves to harm that needs to be managed while they go through it. The ultimate success of going through it and taking back the power from the predator is a well-known healing factor for victims that can't have the courage to come forward. But what I would say is, you need to find counsel that is trauma informed, and that has real meaning. You know, we at Andrews and Thornton and in the law, some of the great law firms that handle these cases nationwide, we know what our clients need. We know the psychological experience to have with them, the time it takes, the patience, the team of counselors we have standing by to aid and assist them through that process. You know, every state has a different requirement about what you must file in order to bring forward a case of this serious nature. And, you know, some law firms, as Kimberly mentioned, just simply can't do it. And we understand, you know, I couldn't do probably what they do, but you looking for a firm that has experience in this type of case, that uses trauma informed techniques and uses victim support. You know, we are called upon in cases to help our clients through the criminal prosecution, to support them as their lawyers and their voice in a criminal prosecution, which can also be a slippery slope for them. How a prosecutor uses their testimony and how damaging that can be to them, and what their voice, we can represent them under Marcy's law, which allows us to come into a criminal case and advocate for the victim witness, the complainant. And we do that as well. And that's been quite a journey to understand in this time in my career, to learn from someone that's experienced as Kimberly, how to serve the needs of those clients. And we have at least 1 or 2 of those representations going on now. And we're doing that on a pro bono basis, by the way. So Kimberly, you want to add to that? Sorry, I'm losing my voice.
Yeah, I just echo, and it's super important to have a trauma-informed lawyer. The cases that we have as the Marcy's Law, a couple of them have been on your show, and it really is just an added layer of support that they have along with their family. Oftentimes in the prosecution, it becomes this tug of war with, you know, the perpetrator oftentimes is the father, the step-parent, the uncle. The mother is now not receiving benefits from the father, the step-parent who's in custody, and the child's put in the middle and they have to testify. Regardless, very difficult for them to walk through the prosecution, testifying, you know, being asked questions by a defense lawyer, but also dealing with the trauma of the actual abuse. In the civil setting, it's kind of the victim takes the power back. She or he decides that they want to file this lawsuit and that they want to stand with their lawyer in order to be the voice for change, to be the voice for the abuser or the organization being held accountable. And it's very empowering for a civil victim. But again, like Ann said, they really do need to have some support. That would be my encouragement. Or go to a firm that has the ability to support you through it.
Beautiful.
That's awesome. Absolutely incredible. Again, you guys, I put the link to the whole interview in the description down below, and you can watch the whole thing. I mean, I've listened to it at least 4 times through, and it's 3 hours long. It really is incredible. And these two are doing absolutely amazing work. All right, let's go through the starred comments and we will wrap this up. Angie Wilson, I cannot gift a membership yet, but I can do a super chat. Thank you so much, Aaron, for covering this very difficult and triggering topic. It's uncomfortable, but necessary. Thank you so much, Angie. Rochelle gifted 1 channel membership. Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. Living the Dream, welcome as a new channel member. And is that Boobologist? Welcome as a new channel member as well. Okay, Sarah Bauman. You should have John on your channel. I might ask him to come on the channel. I'd have to have a specific topic that I wanted to discuss with him. Even just discussing the similarities, compare and contrast Mormonism versus Scientology would be a lot of fun. I did a chat like that with Shalise Ann Sola. And yeah, I'll try to reach out to him. Angie Wilson says the beginning of the end of Scientology has already occurred. Hey, Aaron 2025. Love it. SJ, the hotline goes to the LDS Church law firm. Believe me, the law firm tells them to stay quiet. Northern Girl, this is going to be a game changer. Maya M, it is Curtin McConkie law firm, and bishops are advised to call if someone has disclosed in confession anything that is illegal. Marilyn Honig, it's so sad that parishioners are reporting child SA using the hotline, but inadvertently alerting the religious leaders who cover it up. It's so sick. Vanessa Winbury, good to see you, Vanessa. Scientology also profits from SA by getting donations and free labor from people doing their lower ethics conditions. Absolutely. And, you know, the specific report that Serge read aloud at the LAPD commissioners meeting, that was about Scientologist pedophile Greg Scroy. And part of the making up the damage or contributions far beyond the ordinary demands of a group member, which are 2 of the steps of Scientology's low ethics conditions. Greg Scroy's father, Joe Scroy, donated over $1 million to Scientology to buy the organization in Buffalo a brand new building. And that building was, in fact, the very first Scientology new ideal organization building. That's right. David Miscavige's international real estate scam called the Ideal Organization Project or campaign was started by a Scientologist making a massive donation because his son was exposed as a pedophile. So you want to talk about an organization, a religious organization profiting off of covering up these sex crimes against children. You've got Scientology. It's truly incredible. Wise Mama says, in my opinion, the Catholic and traditional churches do not, by policy or beliefs, condone or preach that the SA that happens. With Scientology, the policies and beliefs directly allow and condone SA that happens. Well, I'll tell you, it is interesting. Yeah. You know, I was going to say that, well, my first response was going to be, you know, the instances that I became aware of in Scientology where someone had done these illegal acts, I became aware of them because those people were in trouble. Like those people were in trouble internally. And so I was going to use that as an example of that maybe perhaps we'd stop short of saying that they actually allow and condone it. However, I'm not going to stop short of that because the truth is when it comes to 14-year-olds, 15-year-olds, 16-year-olds, I'm personally aware of circumstances where the parents of the children were objecting to an illegal sexual relationship And it was the ethics officer who actually intervened to handle the parents on why they would be thinking like a WOG and not like a Scientologist. And that these are staff members, or these are Sea Org members, and these are beings, and these are Thetans, and why would you be saying this? And that it was actually the Scientology authorities themselves that were telling the parents that it wasn't okay for them to object to these age-inappropriate, illegal sexual relationships. So you are correct. You are absolutely correct. I mean, there is some line in Scientology, apparently, but who's drawing that line? I honestly don't even know. Bronzy, slam dunk, Scientology is going to go down one day soon. Constance June, this is an important stream. Wish I could hit the like button more than once to help it get out there. Thank you, Constance. Northern Girl, hey, Osa, are you listening? If not, turn up the sound. You're going to want to hear this. Gabrielle, escaping the cultiverse. This is exactly what happens 100%. I have witnessed this many times in the Vancouver org. I would have never thought of it as sex trafficking. OMG. George Massey, when Miriam pursued Scientology justice against her abuser, Osa shipped her to the UK to live and work with her abuser. Sick bastards. Who was the head of Osa at that time? I'm not sure, George. Who was it? Who was it? I think it was the person who said they'd never heard of or participated in any cover-up of child sex abuse ever in their entire history of Scientology. I don't know. Lauren, in my humble opinion, auditing children is SA, but Scientologists would not likely view it as such while they are indoctrinated. Doc, Irish Church done the same thing, moved them from one country to another country. Apollo Mandos, there is an irony. Miscavige failing to grow Scientology might help keep Scientology off the radar of these guru lawyers who might be busy with the big Mormon in Catholic Wales. Well, I'm sure David Miscavige wishes that Scientology were small enough to stay off the radar of these lawyers, but he would be wrong. It's also incredible to think of the fact that, you know, the Mormon Church, I looked it up while we were listening to one of these segments. They claim to have about 15 million members. In reality, they probably have closer to 5 million members. Compare that to how small Scientology is. 20 to 25,000 members. 5 million, 25,000. And the church that has 5 million members, hundreds of billions of dollars, has senators, has cities, has states. That church is currently being taken behind the woodshed by these attorneys. Scientology has absolutely no chance, you guys. Scientology has no chance. They have no hope. Gabrielle, the most important thing when you're in a cult, especially Scientology, is to protect the church. The real Sassafras is back. Good to see you, Sassafras. I'm glad your account is working. George Massey, the Chris Malin story was seriously disturbing. The Kellycopter interview was a really tough watch, but critical. Yes, I interviewed Chris Malin on my channel as well. Vanessa Winbury, good to see you. Cost-saving measures. Sea Org members on mission staying with public Scientologists. I had to stay with a couple in Buffalo when on mission there, along with my mission. I see my mission in charge. I was 16 years old at the time. Yeah, I remember as like 8, 9, 10, 11-year-old kid, I remember having Sea Org missionaries staying with us. Nothing happened, but I do remember waking up to these strange adults in our house for some reason. Constance, thank you for gifting 5 channel memberships. I appreciate it. Ruth Ann McKillop, I love the way you summarize. Thank you, Ruth Ann. I try. Renegan, the Scientology industrial shredders will be working overtime. Does it matter to you? Not to me. Good to see you, Rib Guy. Scientology will never turn over complete records, in my opinion. Guys, I mean, there's precedent on this. I mean, in the Laura DiCrescenzo lawsuit, this was the last one of the, well, not the last lawsuit against Scientology, but the last big one. Remember, guys, her lawsuit was against Scientology. The crux of the complaint was that she was a minor. She was a minor in the Sea Org who was pressured to terminate a pregnancy against her will while being a child Sea Org member. And this was the essence of her lawsuit. And Scientology dragged this on for 9 years. But what happened, one of the things that happened in those 9 years is Laura's attorney said, hey, all the evidence of everything she's claiming is in her auditing files and her ethics files and her personnel files, and we'd like a copy of all of them, please. Scientology said, what? My pearls? They're protected. And the attorney's like, yeah, they're protected for her benefit, not yours, dumbass. And they said, we're going to take this to the Supreme Court. And they did. And the California Supreme Court ruled against them. And they took it to the Supreme Court, the U.S. Supreme Court. The U.S. Supreme Court refused to hear their appeal. And Scientology turned over a complete record of all of Laura's auditing files and everything else. And all the evidence was there. And they were scheduled to go to trial. The day before the trial was scheduled to begin, Scientology said, all right, we give up. Name your price. They did exactly what John said the Mormon Church will do. And they did exactly what Scientology will do every single time. They will delay until they cannot delay anymore. And then they'll say, name your price. You win. And she named a big fat price with an awful lot of zeros. And Scientology turned over the cold, hard cash. Steffi T said, Aaron, are you going to have these ladies on your channel, or have you already? I do hope to have them on my channel. I haven't asked them to come on, but I think someday soon there will be a good reason to have them on, and I would love to do that. Ashi Burmi, do we know of SA cases in Scientology from 2016 onwards? I would say yes. Eric Rader, saying things out loud makes them real, and it hurts. Yeah. Renegade, your emotion shows your heart. Thank you. Literally Lisa from H-Town. What these cults don't realize is that if they were to complete thorough investigations, ending in disconnection, disfellowshipping, etc., of the perpetrator, the public would applaud them. Hold on a second. What these cults don't realize is that if they were to complete thorough investigations, yes, that's true. The public would applaud them. But then they would also have to turn them over to the authorities. And Scientology doesn't want to set that precedent. So, but yes, I mean, your sentiment is totally correct. Danny May, it's like when you drink the shitty Kool-Aid, you don't know how bad it tastes until you stop taking it. Amber Vaness, it's very hard to talk about your essay. I had a hard time with it. I definitely appreciate the people that have listened to my story. Even if it doesn't do anything, at least it's out. Yes. Robin Wren, Aaron, you're doing important work. We are all 100% behind you. Thank you so much, Robin. Rib Guy, welcome to the outside. We have emotions out here. Ushi Burmi, you may have been part of the organization, Aaron, but you were never part of the problem. You've always fought for survivors to get justice. Thank you, Ushi. Eric Rader, watching others suffer while you act as if you are okay with it. Yeah. Is just one of so many memories about Scientology that makes me sick. Yeah. Ushi Burmi, in my opinion, Mike Rinder was well aware of his actions when he made sure the look-back window closed without an avalanche of cases. I would agree with you. Farrell Cheryl, when those abusing you tell you that you brought it on yourself, yep, we need women like this to fight for us. Jessica LaBarber, shunned, excommunicated, declared for being a person who does not condone criminality. Anne from Massachusetts. They do say that money makes the world go round, and Scientology and the LDS Church have boatloads of money, all taken from the very same people they systematically abuse. Lori Marie, I'm thinking Davey is feeling a tad nervous. Yes. SJ, I am really appreciating this breakdown. Thank you. Farrell Cheryl, as a massage therapist in California, I was a mandatory reporter. If I saw bruises, I had to tell. Wow. Amy Lee SP, Aaron, do you want people to email you if we weren't assaulted, but were subject to interrogation about sexual stuff as a teenager, like when you're trying to get onto the EPF? Amy, go ahead and email me. Whatever information you have, go ahead and email it to me. Wise Mama, how many people do you know at this point do you think have experienced SA? I don't think I could try to put a number on it, Wise Mama, but thank you for the question. Wise Mama, what was that number? 45 million tax-free dollars for Scientology in the Lisa McPherson case 20 years ago? I don't think Scientology paid anywhere close to even $10 million in the Lisa McPherson case, but I'm not, I'd have to double check that. M. Peters, my two favorite podcasts meet. SJ, what an absolute hero she is. Stephen T, does the Mormon Church fair game like Scamatology? You know, based on my interview with Shalise Ansola, I don't think the Mormon Church has a policy such as fair game. Their disconnection policy isn't even as severe as Scientology's disconnection policy, but I don't claim to be an expert. Old Frizz, I'm wondering if Scientology constantly getting victims to sign contracts and agreements not to sue, often leading to tribunals, will make these cases different to Mormon judgments. Well, we will find out soon. Carrie Canitas, how am I getting a wait? How am I getting a hint of a new video while you are still live? I don't know, Carrie. Farrell Cheryl, Scientology, the Pintos of cults. Oh, I love that one. Old Frizz, George Massey, it blows my mind how victims are thrown back to their abusers for justice via internal tribunals by law. Yes, I would love to get these attorneys' perspectives on the unconscionability of those arbitration agreements. Farrell Cheryl, boobologist probably wears combat boots. I don't get it. Dave's Deep Dives. Hey, good to see you, Dave. In the interview, they speak of changing policies, but wouldn't that be impossible for Scientology with all the LRH rules and stuff? Good question, Dave. In Scientology, there is a policy letter called the Structure of Organization, What is Policy? And in this policy letter, L. Ron Hubbard actually creates a mechanism to cancel old policy that is no longer useful and does not forward the expansion of Scientology. Using this mechanism, anyone in charge can, according to LRH policy, use that policy to cancel dated LRH policy that simply no longer serves a constructive purpose in Scientology. I've always thought it was interesting that David Miscavige has never gone that route when he wants to change something. He always pretends like he just found some brand new LRH order coming to an old LRH order coming to light for the first time that some evil messenger had hidden and scrolled away in an attic in New Jersey somewhere. Like, he's always done some convoluted thing to be like, I'm restoring the original LRH tech, instead of being like, hey guys, remember this policy right here that's in the volumes you all have that says every now and then you have to cull all the existing policy and look for policies that existed at that time to handle a problem at that time, but today is no longer serving a constructive purpose. He's never gone that route, but he sure could. And so if he chose to do so, he certainly could. Okay. Konda Takanabe. I work for Mark Robinson, the attorney Ann was speaking about. He is a national treasure and has been an advocate for thousands upon thousands of consumers in mass tort litigations over the decades. That is awesome, Konda. Thank you so much for watching the stream and jumping into the live chat. I really appreciate that. Okay, guys, that is all I have for this evening. It's been a long one, but I'm glad we did this. I'm glad you all joined me for it, and stay tuned for much more this week. It's going to be a wild ride. I'll talk to you guys soon.
Okay, if you want to see my rock and roll songs, click right on this guitar. And if you want to see a different one of my videos, then you could click right inside here. If you have subscribed or not, subscribe